Story 1. My obstetrician told me the story of his saddest delivery. He delivered a baby of a 12-year-old girl. On one of the postpartum rounds, when he went in to check on her, she was asleep and was sucking her thumb. Story 2. Not an employee of a maternity ward, but I have a cousin who is a methamphetamine addict. She has just had her 5th child. Every time she has a baby, it is taken away from her, and she intentionally has another one, hoping she can keep that one. She's incredibly lucky that her parents, my uncle and aunt, have taken in all of her children so they can be together, but they are about 70 years old and have already raised 5 children of their own. I actually hate my cousin for doing this to them. Story 3. On my nursing labor and delivery clinical, I was able to spend a shift in the neonatal intensive care unit. One of the babies was the mother's 5th child. He was born addicted to methamphetamine and was positive for syphilis. The other 4 children are wards of the state. It made me so incredibly sad and mad for this baby. Story 4. I volunteer in a neonatal intensive care unit. Recently, a father who refused to be on the birth certificate started arguing and being disruptive. The baby was sleeping and he woke the baby up. The nurse said he handled the baby roughly. They ended up having to ban him from the neonatal intensive care unit. Child Protective Services was involved already, and hopefully they continue to be. Story 5. I know a couple who were foster carers. Roughly every year, they would get a newborn from a couple who were both on the sex offenders register. They kept getting pregnant despite knowing that the baby would be removed by social services almost immediately. Story 6. My work took me to a perinatal mental health unit. There was a new mother who was an inpatient there. She had the baby a week or 2 ago. She had postpartum psychosis and was currently catatonic. Her husband had asked a member of staff when they could start trying for their second baby. What is wrong with his priorities? He shouldn't be a parent or a husband. Story 7. I mean, it's not uncommon for a woman who does not have custody of her other 3 or more kids due to drugs to get pregnant, while still doing those same drugs, and once again not get custody of the new baby, but also refuse to go on any long-term form of birth control like an intrauterine device that would let them do drugs in peace without making more babies. Infinitely baffling to me. If you would prefer to do meth over everything else and pregnancy is unwanted, why not take steps to not get pregnant? Story 8. Not a medical professional, but my baby was born premature and spent a little over a month in the neonatal intensive care unit. It was the hardest thing I've ever experienced. My wife and I were fortunate enough to be able to do shifts and care for our little guy almost around the clock. The baby next to us was born the same day as our son and seemed to have a similar experience with needing a ventilator and oxygen. To my knowledge, not once in those 34 days did he have a visitor or anyone to hold him and comfort him besides the excellent nurses there. I think about that baby a lot, and I really hope he graduated and found a home with people who will love him a great deal. Story 9. Not in the maternity ward, but in the emergency department we have a regular patient. She has had 8 kids taken away. She said she is going to keep having them until she gets to keep one. Story 10. I was a student nurse shadowing a community health visitor. We visited a pregnant woman who hadn't found out the gender of the baby yet. She, for some reason, told us that her boyfriend, the father of the baby, had been previously convicted of sexual assault against a child under 13. The mother said it so casually and was angry that people kept judging him for a mistake he made. The health visitor was horrified and asked if she wasn't worried he would hurt her sons, 2 boys under 10 from a previous relationship. She just said, "Of course not, they're boys," basically admitting this man did something to a young girl. So the health visitor asked, "What if the baby you're having now is a girl?" This woman literally shrugged and said, "Then I'll abort it and we'll try again until we get a boy." She said it so casually, like she was talking about the weather. I've never been more disgusted with a human, and I hope that the children are safe. Story 11. Not a medical professional, but my folks own a group home that specializes in caring for medically complex young children who require 24-hour nurse care. Most of their kids have been wards of the state. Aside from the terribly sad drug situations others have posted about, they commonly get kids who have issues due to drugs during pregnancy. One case that stands out to me is a woman who apparently drank bleach regularly throughout her pregnancy. hoping her kid would turn out blonde. This ruined the baby's brain and caused a lot of other serious medical issues. Story 12, paramedic here. I used to occasionally do interfacility transports with a neonatal intensive care unit team, including a nurse practitioner, registered nurse, and myself in the back, though they do most of the heavy lifting and so many opioid-addicted newborns. I remember the first time I had to calculate a fentanyl drip for a 6-pound baby so he didn't go into withdrawals. Can't get clean for the pregnancy, but also refuse to do anything to prevent pregnancy. It's heartbreaking. Story 13. I worked in the maternity ward for over 10 years. I saw many questionable parents, drug users who were high and had no prenatal care. Parents would curse at their newborns and tell the baby to be quiet. Women with mental health disorders who were, at the time, dangerous to their child. A mother fighting with her child's father, throwing things like a food tray across the room at him, with the baby in the midst. Another thing I hated to see were parents telling people not to hold their newborn because it would spoil the baby. Once, parents left a newborn alone in the room to go outside and smoke or do drugs. Parents threatened to sue us because we made a birth certificate for their baby. There was a young mom with 4 kids, 3 years and under. When it was time to go home, she put all the children in the car's back seat, and only the newborn had a car seat. Sometimes the police would be waiting outside at discharge if one of the parents had a warrant for arrest. Lots of sad situations. Story 14, family medicine clinic here. We had a woman from out of town bring her 5-year-old in. The child is healthy enough, but they both stink to high heaven. The smell lingered in the exam room after they left, for hours. The mother's feet and clothes are filthy. It turns out the mother also needed medical care because she was pregnant and had been experiencing some vaginal bleeding. She has had 2 miscarriages in the last year, has had no prenatal care, already has 5 children, only 1 or 2 with her, and is living in an old camping trailer with her boyfriend and kids. Her boyfriend made her come to the doctor because of the bleeding, but she didn't think it was a big deal. She was supposed to come in for a follow-up, but they left town the next week. They were traveling in the trailer and wanted to let the children decide where they stayed. I hope she's okay, but I'm doubtful. Story 15. When my son was in the neonatal intensive care unit, the mother of the baby next to him would barge in, turn on the overhead lights, which were only supposed to be on for procedures, and knock on her baby's incubator to wake them up. Story 16. Not an employee, but a good friend of mine has adopted 2 babies from the foster system who are half-siblings. No idea who the fathers are, but they have the same mother. The mother is in her 30s and has had 9 babies now. She is a sex worker and drug addict, but whenever she finds out she is pregnant, she does something to go to jail where she gets clean and gives birth. The last baby she had, she was alone in her cell and just left him on the floor while she went back to bed. Thankfully, guards found him before he froze to death. He is the most gorgeous 3-year-old now. They know where 5 of the 9 siblings, all adopted, are and keep them in touch with one another. Story 17. Not really the gist of the question, but at a house party, a woman who was so drunk she couldn't stand up and nearly burned holes in the furniture with her cigarettes and bong announced, in a comically loud stage whisper, that she was a few months pregnant but not to worry because she had already scheduled an abortion. The entire room heaved a sigh of relief, given she'd already had 4 other children seized by the state. Then someone asked why she didn't just use birth control. Her answer? You can't prove that stuff works, and also I'm not going to pollute my body with hormones. Wow. I feel sorry for her remaining eggs. Story 18. I worked in an abortion clinic in the 1990s, and I remember a young woman who couldn't stay sober long enough to have the abortion she wanted. Fetal alcohol syndrome is more serious than people know. Sad. Story 19. I once had a 10th grade student who was pregnant with her 3rd child. It was horrible. I felt so bad for her. All 3 babies were with the worst guy ever. He was so mean. I had him in class too. Story 20. I was on a labor and delivery unit as a student nurse. We had a young mother who had just given birth to her 2nd child. The mother refused to stop smoking marijuana throughout her entire pregnancy, as she didn't feel there was enough evidence to say it was harmful to the baby. Her child was born early, underweight, and with other illnesses that will follow them through life. She couldn't go more than 2 hours without going outside to smoke, even if that meant leaving the baby alone in the room. She refused to tell the nursing staff when she was stepping out or left the baby with her young cousin, who did not know how to hold a baby and almost let the baby aspirate on its own vomit. We had to increase her room checks to every 20 minutes out of fear for the infant's safety. The cherry on top is that while all this was going on, her first child was down the hall in the pediatrics unit for juvenile diabetes management. She had already chosen to let her first child stay full-time with his father, as she didn't feel like she could care for him until she got her life together. She didn't visit her son, not even once, even though he was maybe 30 feet away. There are far, far worse cases out there, to be sure. I just can't help but wonder how both of those kids are now. Story 21. I am not an employee of a maternity ward, but I did see something awful when I visited my friend after she had her baby. Her husband was just sitting in the corner of the room playing on his Nintendo Switch while she was recovering from hemorrhaging and almost dying, and trying to figure out how to take care of a baby. Things got so bad they had to resuscitate her, so when we got there a few days later, she still looked horrible. When she was changing his diaper, I could tell she had never changed a baby's diaper before, let alone a boy's diaper. I tried to warn her about how boys can pee, but it was too late, and the baby peed all over her. My husband and I were trying to help her out and get a nurse to come get her changed, and her husband was still sitting in the corner playing on his Nintendo Switch and ignoring everything. When the nurse got in there, my friend eventually snapped and yelled at her husband to help her. My husband, the nurse, and I just awkwardly looked at each other. I can't imagine how many times nurses have to see situations like that. It would make me so upset. Story 22. My worst experience was a consultation with a woman who had her daughters taken away because their biological father was sexually abusing them. She had 7 or 8 children, I can't remember, and was pregnant again. There were so many issues. The housing wasn't good enough because of mold. It was a small house. Both parents were doing drugs and drinking. They had no family support, and neither worked. Her toddler son was dirty. His nappy looked heavy, he had no shoes on, and he had to walk. I never felt like shaking a patient before. At the time, I was struggling to get pregnant, and it just broke my heart, knowing my foster child could have experienced some of this. Story 23. When I was a student, I overheard some midwives talking about some new parents. They fed the baby at 3 p.m. and then said, "We don't need to feed it again until tomorrow, right?" The midwives were shocked and were like, "Oh, my sweet summer child, you're in for a shock, aren't you?" Story 24. Not an obstetrician. I'm someone who gave birth. I heard another new mom in the same ward speak to her newborn baby boy. "Sure now, boys don't cry," over and over. I could only imagine how that poor child will be brought up. Story 25. In my labor and delivery/postpartum rotation as a student nurse over 20 years ago, I took care of a 13-year-old girl who had given birth to a premature baby, and the baby had some serious medical problems, so was transferred to the children's hospital right next door. I worked nights, so I was able to wheel the teenage mom over to see her baby. The teenage mom was in the custody of the state living in a group home and had gotten pregnant from a teenage boy in the group home. Therefore, the baby was a ward of the state, and custody of the child was in question. Her mom, the baby's grandma, came to visit. I needed to stay in the room because it was a supervised visit, and it was both heartbreaking and terrifying to hear the mom/grandma go on about how the judge would give the preemie to her because she was blood-related. Some of the teenage mom's friends came to visit her, and they were all talking about how fun it would be to dress the baby up and play with it. They were acting like you would expect most 13 and 14-year-olds with minimal experience in the reality of caring for a baby, let alone a preemie. While I couldn't say anything to the family, I had some thoughts and feelings about this. Firstly, Grandma, all of your children are in state custody because of medical neglect and your continued alcohol abuse. No judge is going to give you custody of a preemie with major medical problems that will persist for the child's whole life. Secondly, Mom, your child is not a toy doll. Your child will live in a neonatal intensive care unit for months. And when the baby does come home, it will need around-the-clock care for the rest of his life. No judge is going to give custody of this child to a 14-year-old who is living in a group home. Story 26. Well, I was a Child Protective Services social worker, But this story took place in a maternity ward. An addicted mother had stayed off heroin for a few days because she was scared of testing positive while birthing her baby. She gave birth, and the baby's father or boyfriend snuck some heroin into her while still in the hospital. She nodded off and dropped the newborn out of her arms and onto the floor. Thankfully, the little girl was okay in the end. She was a little bruised and had some withdrawal symptoms, as well as being small for her age, but I kept track of her until she was 6 or 7, and she was thriving. Her parents refused rehabilitation or doing anything, so she was adopted very early by a great family.